December 13th, 1937, the outskirts of Nanjing, China. The air was cold enough to bite through wool coats. Frost clung to the tall reeds along the Qinhuai River, and the faint sound of artillery echoed like distant thunder. In the gray dawn, a young woman named Li Mei crouched behind a crumbling wall near Zhongshan Gate, clutching her brother's hand. They had walked for days from the countryside, believing that Nanjing, the capital, would offer safety. But as the first columns of the Imperial Japanese Army entered the city that morning, safety became a word without meaning. The sound came first engines, boots, and shouted commands in clipped, foreign syllables. Then, the metallic crack of rifle bolts. Within hours, the streets of Nanjing were crawling with soldiers from the 16th Division, led by Lieutenant General Kasago Nakajima. Their orders were simple: take the city, destroy resistance, and purge all enemy elements. What began as a military operation quickly descended into unrestrained slaughter. Li Mei watched as the first civilians were dragged from a nearby house: an old man, a schoolteacher, and 2 teenage boys. They were lined against a wall. A machine gun rattled, sharp and quick, followed by silence. The soldiers laughed. One of them lit a cigarette from the burning roof. By nightfall, the city burned. The Nanjing Safety Zone, hastily organized by a group of foreigners led by John Raab, a German businessman, was already overwhelmed. Tens of thousands of Chinese civilians poured into its boundaries, clutching children, bundles of clothes, and fading hope. Outside those few protected blocks, Nanjing became a killing field. On the banks of the Yangtze River, soldiers rounded up groups of prisoners, men suspected of being Chinese soldiers who had discarded their uniforms. At Mufu Mountain and along Xiaquan docks, they were forced to kneel, hands bound with telephone wire. Witnesses later described what followed as the machine gun lottery. One line after another, hundreds at a time, gunned down into the water. When the barrels overheated, bayonets finished the rest. The river turned dark with blood and oil. Ice floated between the bodies. In the Confucius Temple district, homes were torn open. Women and girls were dragged into alleys and courtyards. Soldiers competed in acts of cruelty, rape, mutilation, disembowelment, often laughing as they posed for photographs. Some were forced to watch their families killed before being executed themselves. John Raab wrote in his diary that night, "Never have I seen such brutality. They kill the men, rape the women, loot and burn everything. The streets are filled with corpses. We can do nothing but record the crimes." Li Mei and her brother hid in a storage cellar beneath an abandoned tea house. From the cracks in the floorboards above, she could see the boots of soldiers passing, hear the distant screams that rose and fell like the wind. At one point, a hand grabbed the cellar door. She held her breath. Then a shout, footsteps retreating, the sound of a door slamming. She didn't move for hours. By the third day, the city was silent in places where life had once thrived. Hospitals were ransacked, churches looted, and hospitals turned into makeshift barracks. The dead lay where they fell in streets, courtyards, even temple steps. Dogs fed on the bodies. One survivor, Reverend John Maji, filmed what he could with a 16mm camera, the first evidence of the massacre that would later be smuggled out of China. His footage showed what no testimony could fully capture: the blank eyes of a mother clutching her dead child, a man's skull split open by a sword, the long, gray columns of refugees trudging through ashes. And still, the killing did not stop. Inside the Japanese command posts, officers boasted about competitions who could behead more prisoners in less time. Newspapers back in Tokyo reported heroic exploits, naming Lieutenants Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda as champions in the so-called 100-man killing contest. Both men smiled for the camera, their swords gleaming. The article called it a display of valor, but in Nanjing, no words could disguise the truth. As Li Mei crept through the ruined streets days later, she found her brother's body among the dead near Taiping Gate. His face was half buried in snow, his hands still tied behind his back. She didn't cry. There were no tears left. She simply sat beside him until the frost began to numb her legs. The sky was a pale, merciless blue. Somewhere in the distance, a temple bell rang, hollow, mechanical, unfeeling. The city that had once been the heart of China now lay gutted, its soul scattered among the ashes and bones. The week that followed was not a passage of time. It was an unending night. By December 20th, 1937, Nanjing had become a necropolis. The smell of decay hung over the city like a fog, so thick that even the crows avoided flying low. Smoke rose from smoldering ruins where entire neighborhoods once stood. The winter wind carried the cries of those still alive muffled, fading, like whispers from the underworld. In a half-collapsed warehouse near the river, a missionary named Minnie Vautrin counted the women under her protection. She had turned Jinling Women's College into a sanctuary, defying orders, pleading with Japanese soldiers, begging for decency that rarely came every night. She recorded the same words in her diary: "We saved a few, but not enough." Outside the college walls, the soldiers of the 6th and 16th Divisions patrolled the streets, drunk on rice wine and the absence of command. The rules of war had dissolved. Civilians were nothing more than shadows moving through debris prey in an open cage. Near the Yangtze docks, truckloads of prisoners continued to arrive. They were herded into open fields, stripped of coats, forced to kneel in rows that stretched farther than the eye could see. The air cracked with rifle fire, followed by the dull rhythm of shovels against frozen earth. In some areas, bayonets were used to conserve ammunition. A Japanese private later confessed. We were told they were all soldiers in disguise, but even children were among them. We stopped thinking after the first 100. Not far away, Li Mei wandered through what had once been her neighborhood. She avoided the main roads, moving through alleys littered with broken glass and spent cartridges. In a burned courtyard, she found a well that had turned black with ashes. Floating inside were fragments of clothing, a child's sleeve, a red ribbon. She turned away. At dusk, she reached the edge of the safety zone, where foreign flags hung limply over the gates. John Rabe himself stood there, pale and shaking, demanding entry for the civilians. A Japanese officer sneered but waved them through. Inside, the narrow courtyards overflowed with the displaced 200,000 people crammed into a few city blocks. The ground was slick with mud, urine, and melted snow. That night, the sound of boots approached again. Soldiers entered the compound despite promises of safety. They tore through the crowds, searching for traitors. The screams began anew. Li Mei pressed herself against the wall, clutching the sleeve of a stranger's coat. Somewhere in the chaos, someone shouted in German Rabe's voice, ordering the soldiers to leave. For a moment, the brutality paused, then resumed. Elsewhere in the city, Reverend Meiji continued filming. Through his camera lens, he captured the aftermath, bodies stacked like timber along the Qinhuai River, the limbs stiff from cold, the eyes glazed in the half-light. He moved silently between them, his breath visible in the air, his hands shaking. "If I do not record this," he whispered to himself, the world will not believe. The hospitals were overflowing. Chinese doctors, working under the watch of foreign missionaries, performed surgeries with kitchen knives and boiling water. Morphine was gone. The wounded begged for death rather than treatment. One nurse later recalled, "The floor was red, the sheets red. Even the walls seemed to absorb it. We could not wash the blood away fast enough." Outside the hospital gates, Japanese soldiers continued to burn the dead hundreds at a time using kerosene and straw. The firelight flickered against the frost, illuminating the faces of onlookers hiding in the dark. Li Mei stood among them. Her hair was matted, her clothes torn, her body trembling from hunger. She hadn't spoken in days. From behind her, an old man murmured, "Heaven sees this." But the heavens were silent. Days stretched into weeks. By early January 1938, what remained of Nanjing was a city of ghosts. The snow covered the corpses like a shroud. The river, once the lifeline of commerce, carried the evidence of annihilation, drifting bodies frozen in grotesque stillness, their shadows flickering beneath the ice. Inside the safety zone, disease began to spread. Typhus, dysentery, and hunger claimed hundreds more. Even in supposed refuge, death was patient, methodical, and yet, amid the ruin, fragments of humanity persisted. A boy shared his bread crust with a stranger. A nurse stitched a wound with trembling hands. A foreigner shielded a woman from a soldier's blow, absorbing it himself. In those small, defiant acts, something resisted extinction. Li Mei, hollow-eyed but unbroken, stared across the river one night. The horizon glowed faintly orange from the fires still burning in the lower city. Behind her, someone whispered a prayer in a language she didn't understand. Ahead of her, the wind carried the faint echo of laughter soldiers drunk, victorious, celebrating in the ruins. The world outside Nanjing would not know not yet. Cameras were confiscated, letters censored, reporters silenced. But the screams of that winter would travel through generations, carried in memory, in silence, in the unmarked graves beneath the modern city that would one day rise again. January 1938. The Yangtze River was frozen at its edges, a mirror of pale ice reflecting a sky the color of gunmetal. Beneath its surface, the current carried what the soldiers left behind. Bodies, men, women, children drifting together in slow procession, their limbs locked in death's silent choreography. Fishermen who dared approach the water were warned away by bayonets. "These are not fish to catch," one soldier said. "These are ghosts." Li Mei walked along the embankment with the others who still searched. She had wrapped her brother's scarf around her face to block the stench, the sweet, sick smell of rot that no wind could carry away. Every step crunched on a carpet of ashes, broken glass, and bones. What had once been the city's lifeline now resembled a graveyard without markers. In the distance, she saw smoke rising from the cremation pits near Siakwon. The Japanese had begun burning the evidence. Truckloads of corpses, thousands each day, dumped into trenches, soaked in kerosene, and set ablaze. The flames reached high enough to cast shadows against the ruined walls. When the smoke drifted over the safety zone, even the missionaries fell silent. John Magee's last reels of film captured fragments of those days before he was forced to stop. A street littered with bayoneted bodies. A young mother frozen in death, her arms still encircling her infant. A man lying in the snow with his hands clasped as if in prayer, though his head was gone. He later wrote, "You could tell where the Japanese had passed by the smell alone. Burned homes, burned flesh, the odor of death hung in layers, clinging to one's skin, one's hair, we lived in it. Inside Jinling College, Minnie Vautrin grew gaunt from sleepless nights and starvation. She rationed rice for the thousands of women huddled in classrooms and basements. Each day, she faced soldiers at the gates, standing between them and those she protected. Sometimes she succeeded. Sometimes she did not. Her diary entries from that month became a record of despair tonight. They came again. I cannot stop them all. I only pray that God closes their eyes. By mid-January, the massacre began to slow not from mercy, but exhaustion. The soldiers had run out of victims. Entire districts of Nanjing were empty shells. The Japanese army began using surviving civilians for forced labor clearing rubble, burying corpses, or dismantling buildings for supplies. Li Mei was one of them. Each morning, she and others were marched to the killing grounds with shovels. Under armed watch, they dug mass graves trenches 30 meters long and 2 meters deep. The frozen soil cracked under the blades. When they unearthed frozen bodies, they dragged them by their limbs, stacking them neatly, face down, in layers. No one spoke. The guards smoked and laughed above them. One day, Li Mei found herself staring into the lifeless face of a woman no older than 20, a silk ribbon still tied around her hair. She looked peaceful, almost asleep. For a moment, Li Mei froze. Then a soldier barked an order, and she dropped the body into the pit. The sound it made when it struck the others was a dull, final thud. By late January, the river thawed, revealing what the ice had hidden. Along its banks, bloated bodies floated in clusters, thousands of them, tangled in reeds, bumping gently against the shore. The Japanese called it cleansing the battlefield, but the Chinese who survived called it what it was, the River of Bones. Foreigners who remained in Nanjing wrote frantic letters to the outside world. American missionary George Fitch managed to smuggle Maji's footage out of China, hidden inside metal film canisters marked as educational materials. When shown months later in Shanghai and the United States, the world saw for the first time the unfiltered evidence of the massacre, but many dismissed it as Chinese propaganda. Truth in those years was slow to surface. Li Mei survived by working in the burial teams until February, when the Japanese began rebuilding administrative control. She escaped one night through the burned gates of the Western District, walking barefoot along the frozen road toward Wuhu. Each breath came out as white mist. The stars above her were sharp and cold. She carried nothing, no food, no belongings, not even her name, which she would later change to forget. Behind her, the ruins of Nanjing smoldered under the moonlight. Somewhere among the ashes lay her brother, her neighbors, the world she had known. She did not look back. Years later, in testimony recorded before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, she would speak softly, almost mechanically. They killed until there was no one left to kill. We stopped counting when the numbers no longer mattered. In total, more than 200,000 souls perished by bullet, by blade, by fire, by cold. Tens of thousands of women were raped. The city was erased and rewritten in blood. And yet, history written by the victors tried to erase even that. Official Japanese military records were destroyed, reports sanitized, photographs confiscated. For decades, silence replaced memory. But beneath the new city that rose from the ruins, the earth still remembers. The bones are still there. Spring, 1938. Nanjing thawed not into rebirth, but into revelation. The snow receded, uncovering what the winter had tried to hide. Charred beams, unmarked graves, fragments of human life, a child's shoe. A bent coin, a broken teacup. Everywhere the ground cracked open. The dead waited just beneath. The Japanese army, now occupying the city, spoke of restoration and order. Streets were cleared. Shops reopened. Banners hung with slogans of the new regime. But the silence was unnatural. Beneath every sound, a hammer, a horse's hoof, a door closing. There was an echo, as if the city itself remembered too much to speak freely. Li Mei lived among the ruins, one of the nameless survivors too weak to flee. She found refuge in the abandoned mission compound, helping sweep the chapel and carry water for the wounded. Her eyes had aged beyond her years. Sometimes, when she heard Japanese voices outside, her hands trembled so violently she dropped whatever she held. At night, she slept near the window, watching the river. The fires were gone now, replaced by mist. But she swore she could still see them, the flames, the bodies, the endless smoke. Memory had no endpoint. It simply changed form. Across the city, a handful of foreigners remained, compiling what evidence they could before being expelled. John Rabe, the German businessman who had saved thousands, returned to Berlin later that year, bringing his diaries and photographs. He hoped his testimony would awaken conscience in his homeland. Instead, he was arrested by the Gestapo for embarrassing Japan, a German ally. In Nanjing, Reverend Meiji continued his ministry, burying film reels in the earth behind the church before he too was forced to leave. Minnie Vautrin stayed until 1940. Her diary entries darkened with each month. Every night I hear the cries. I cannot forget their faces. When she returned to the United States, her health failed. She took her own life soon after. The survivors tried to resume existence, but not life. Factories reopened. Schools held classes again. Yet the laughter of children never sounded the same. Women walked with lowered eyes, many of them carrying infants born from assault. Men limped through the markets, their silence heavier than any wound. Every spring, when the river flooded, bones surfaced again, white fragments among the reeds. The locals collected them quietly, piling them beneath willow trees, covering them with stones. No prayers, no markers, only the act of burial itself, done with trembling hands. Li Mei once went to the southern hills where the mass graves lay. The wind carried the smell of earth and smoke. She knelt, pressing her palms to the soil. I remember, she whispered, even if the world does not. She lived another 40 years, through new wars, new governments, and the slow reconstruction of the city that had once devoured itself. By the 1970s, skyscrapers began to rise over the old killing grounds. Tourists walked the same streets that had once run red. The city's name became a symbol of progress, its wounds paved over, its ghosts ignored, but not erased. In 1985, the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall was built on the site of one of the largest mass graves, the Tangshan Burial Pit. Archaeologists unearthed the remains of over 10,000 victims. The bones lay in precise layers. Skulls fractured, spines twisted, limbs tangled together, as if still resisting death. Visitors walked silently through the glass corridors, looking down at the evidence of cruelty too vast for words. Old women stood there and wept not for themselves, but for the generations that no longer remembered. One of them was Li Mei. Her hair was white, her body frail, but her eyes, those gray, haunted eyes, still held the reflection of 1937. She stood before the glass case, pressed her hand against it, and whispered a name only she could hear. Outside, children ran through the courtyard, laughing beneath cherry blossoms. The The city was alive again, unaware that beneath its soil slept 1,000,000 unspoken memories. For decades, denial continued in textbooks, in politics, in diplomacy. Some called it exaggeration. Others said it never happened. Yet the earth beneath Nanjing tells no lies. Every excavation, every bone, every bullet casing is testimony carved into time. And still, every December, survivors gather fewer each year to light candles by the river. Their voices quiver with age, but their words remain unbroken. We remember. The river remembers. The world must remember. The wind carries their chants over the dark water, over the rebuilt bridges and the neon lights. Beneath that same river, the current still moves, whispering through the bones of the forgotten. History tries to move forward, but memory, like the river, never stops flowing. Today, when you walk through modern Nanjing, the city hums with life-glass towers shimmer in the sunlight, traffic drones like a heartbeat, and the Qinhuai River, once a river of bones, runs calm and green beneath its bridges. Students gather in cafes. Vendors sell roasted chestnuts. And neon light reflects in puddles where fire once burned. But beneath the concrete and steel lies another city, the one that never left. Every foundation, every turn of the spade during construction, reveals fragments of what was buried but not gone. A child's skull, a soldier's button, a ring, engraved with characters worn away by fire. They surface quietly, carried upward by rain and time, reminders that peace is built on the bones of memory. The Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall stands today as both museum and grave. It houses 10 615 sets of remains, thousands of personal items, and hundreds of photographs once hidden from the world. The walls are lined with testimonies, words trembling between horror and exhaustion. They laughed as they killed. I pretended to be dead. When I opened my eyes, my sister was gone. We buried our neighbors in the snow. Visitors walk the long concrete corridor in silence, guided by dim light and the sound of a low, eternal hum, an audio installation that mimics the wind over the river. At the end of the hall stands a single inscription, Victims 300,000. Remember history, cherish peace. But the number is not what haunts most who come. It is the quiet. The stillness that seeps into your bones when you realize that every statistic was once a breath, a name, a human being who could have lived. Li Mei's name is not listed there. Like most who perished or survived in anonymity, her story is lost among the millions of untold voices. Yet her memory, and those like hers, are what give weight to history itself. The massacre was not one event. It was 6 weeks of methodical destruction that stripped an entire city of its humanity. Between December 13, 1937 and February 1938, an estimated $200,000 to 300,000 civilians and prisoners of war were executed by the Imperial Japanese Army. Tens of thousands of women, possibly over 80,000, were raped. 1/3 of the city was burned to the ground. The soldiers responsible came from multiple divisions, the 6th, 9th, 16th, and 114th, under the command of Prince Asaka, uncle of Emperor Hirohito. Few faced justice. After the war, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East and the Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal tried a handful of officers. Some were executed, others were sentenced to short terms. Most, including Asaka, were never punished. Japan's post-war silence lasted decades. School books omitted the massacre. Officials avoided the word itself, calling it instead a tragedy of war. But silence does not erase truth. It merely delays its reckoning. In recent years, historians and survivors' descendants have fought to preserve the testimonies, digitally recording them before time erases the last witnesses. Only a few dozen still live, their voices thin, their memories sharp as glass. Each year, they gather at the memorial hall, lighting white candles along the reflecting pool. The wind always rises then, as if the city itself exhales. Standing there, you can still hear it, not screams, but echoes. The soft hum of memory in the air, the vibration of history refusing to die. This was not merely a Chinese tragedy. It was a human one, a warning of what happens when nations lose their soul, when propaganda replaces empathy, and when silence becomes a weapon deadlier than any sword. The Nanjing Massacre is not a story of the past. It is a mirror one that forces every generation to ask itself, when we bury the truth beneath the soil of progress, how long before it rises again? What are your thoughts on the crimes committed in Nanjing and the silence that followed? Please share your thoughts in the comments below.